Tonight we return to a simpler time, a time of castles, crowns, and absolutely no refrigeration. Let's talk about a king, a very powerful king, a very dead king, and a very messy funeral. But before we proceed, quick moment of honesty. This is actually my very first time making a video like this, so if you're enjoying it so far, or just here for the exploding monarchs, consider subscribing. You could be one of the channel's earliest supporters, which basically makes you historical too. Meet King William III of England, also known as William the Conqueror. You might remember him as the guy who stormed across the English Channel in tents and said, "This land, mine now." He was fierce in battle, brilliant in strategy, not great at funerals, especially his own. After decades of ruling with an iron fist and eating like a man who'd never heard of portion control, William grew rotund. Like, very rotund. By the time he died in 1087, from falling off a horse and rupturing his belly, the royal doctors were like, yeah, no saving that. So he died. In Normandy. In the summer. Without modern embalming. And that's where the fun begins. Because transporting a giant, decomposing king across medieval roads in July, that's not a vibe. His body bloated. His skin blackened. Priests begged people to stand upwind. Then came the funeral. At the abbey, as monks tried to force his swollen corpse into a fancy stone coffin meant for someone half his size, there was a moment of silence. Then a loud pop. Yep. He exploded. Right there, in church. Hot gases, internal rot, the pressure of royalty. Boom. The smell reportedly cleared the room faster than a Viking raid. The priests returned. Eventually. Someone mumbled a prayer. The lid went on. And that was that. So if you're ever feeling bloated, just remember, at least you didn't go full medieval monarch and detonate at your own funeral. But while the abbey aired out and the monks tried to forget what just happened, the legend of William's explosive send-off only began to grow. Word spread fast. Faster than the stench, even. Peasants whispered it in taverns. Nobles snickered behind velvet curtains. And somewhere, in a smoky medieval scriptorium, a bored monk probably wrote in the margins of a holy manuscript, "King go boom." Of course, no one wanted to admit it publicly. He was still the conqueror. The man who united England, reshaped feudalism, and made entire armies tremble. But after the pop heard round Normandy, even the most devoted chroniclers had to face facts. The king had died not with a roar, but with a squish. Now, history books like to focus on the battles, the castles, the political reforms, all the shiny parts of William's rule. But they tend to skip the bit where his corpse turned into a medieval pressure cooker and blew open in front of God and everyone. And maybe that's fair. But let's be honest. If you lived in 1087, would you remember a tax reform, or the moment a king exploded like a royal meat balloon? Exactly. And here's the thing. William wasn't the only one. Medieval Europe was basically one big no-refrigeration zone, and royal burials? They were rough. Take Pope Formosus, for example. They dug him up and put him on trial. Or King Henry VIII, whose corpse reportedly burst in his coffin too, leaving a trail so disturbing that one chronicler simply wrote, "The dogs licked up what they found." So, if you're wondering whether this was a one-time royal detonation, think again. Exploding monarchs were kind of a thing. Still, William's case was special. Not just because of the sheer volume involved, but because of the irony. He conquered nations. He redrew maps. But in the end, he couldn't even fit in his own coffin. After the explosion, William's funeral attendants did what any self-respecting medieval clergyman would do. They pretended it didn't happen. They wiped down what they could. Said a few very rushed prayers. Slammed the coffin lid shut like they were trapping a demon. And then, in the most British way possible, they buried the whole mess. Physically and emotionally. For a while, that was the end of it. But time has a funny way of poking around in places it shouldn't. Centuries later, archaeologists would uncover parts of that same abbey, and with them, the long forgotten remains of the very king who had detonated in sacred stone. And guess what? Turns out William's bones were missing. Most of them, anyway. Over the years, wars, revolutions, and one very confused gravedigger scattered his remains all over Normandy. At one point, a bishop swore he'd found the king's femur and decided to rebury it with honor. It wasn't his femur, it was a cow bone. So now, what's left of William the Conqueror rests in a stone tomb in Caen, France, marked with a Latin inscription, polished by time, and almost certainly empty. Which is kind of poetic, isn't it? A king who couldn't be stopped in life, who couldn't be contained in death, and who, even in rest, just vanished. You can still visit that tomb today. If you want, you'll see flowers, a plaque, maybe even a tour guide trying to explain how the father of modern England lies beneath your feet. But you'll know the truth. He's not really there. At least not all of him. Part of him might be buried under church stones. Another part lost in a field. Maybe a piece of him floated down the Seine after the explosion. And maybe, just maybe, a single royal toenail still lingers in some monastery crawl space, waiting to ruin another funeral. And so, the story of King William became one of those tales that hovered somewhere between history and warning label. A medieval, don't try this at home. Kids in villages grew up hearing whispers, not just of the Battle of Hastings, but of the king who won England and lost to his own belly. Priests told the tale behind stained glass. Tavern drunks reenacted it with bread rolls and slaps to the gut. And somewhere, probably, a very early bard turned it into a hauntingly off-key lute ballad. But not everyone was laughing. In the royal courts that followed, kings got paranoid. They started obsessing over funeral logistics. Suddenly, embalming wasn't just for saints. It was for anyone who didn't want to become history's punchline. William's son, Henry I, allegedly demanded his body be sealed and preserved like a relic before death. One chronicler said he even carried herbs with him in old age, just in case he keeled over on the wrong day of summer. And remember, this was medieval England. People believed in curses, demons, and the occasional resurrection. So the idea of a monarch exploding in God's house, that wasn't just gross. It was unholy. For years after, the abbey where William burst became the stuff of nervous legends. Locals said you could still hear a faint pop echoing in the nave on humid days. Others swore the stones of the church floor were stained in a way no scrubbing could fix. And then there were the smell stories. Always the smell. One monk wrote, centuries later, in shaky Latin, that the ghost of William occasionally returned, not in form, but in scent. A wave of putrid air, sudden and sulphurous, that crept through the halls and made candles flicker. They called it the royal wind. Monarchs after William were buried with more care, certainly. But they also began commissioning larger coffins, just in case. Some were so roomy you could park a medieval carriage in them. Others had drainage holes, which honestly says more about medieval medicine than any plague ever could. The legacy of William the Conqueror was this. He defeated kings, he changed governments, and he single-handedly created the medieval version of Tupperware panic. Still, you can't deny his impact. Literally. The king who unified England also became the punchline of every posthumous nobleman's worst fear. And for that, along with conquering half of Western Europe, he earned something few rulers ever get: immortality through embarrassment. Over time, the tale of William's unfortunate detonation took on a kind of twisted sanctity. No matter how many scribes tried to quietly sweep it under the vellum, the people remembered. Because stories like that, the messy, the uncomfortable, the unbelievably human, stick around longer than royal decrees ever could. And as the centuries ticked by, the legend only grew. By the late Middle Ages, the tale of the popped king became a favorite among traveling jesters and street performers. Some wore padded bellies under their robes, waddled onto village stages, and acted out William's final moments with an enthusiastic "Foom!" and a pouch of rotting vegetables tossed into the crowd. It killed, metaphorically, every time. In taverns, rowdy drinkers toasted him not with reverence but with snorts and burps, to the king who couldn't hold it in. But in royal circles, the story remained an uncomfortable wrinkle, a kind of historical rash they didn't want to scratch too publicly. Yet, even behind castle walls, kings began to get very particular about their post-mortem plans. Edward III's court records included detailed notes about internal preservation and ventilation of the sarcophagus. Queen Eleanor of Castile requested that her body be divided into 4 separate locations just to avoid, well, what happened to William. By the Renaissance, the incident had gained such mythical weight that one Italian historian insisted the king didn't explode from rot, but from divine punishment, claiming in florid Latin that the Lord burst him for his pride. He also said a ray of light shot from the altar as it happened. No one believed him, but it made for an awesome fresco. Meanwhile, in France, where William had actually died, nobles went out of their way to not bring him up. Normandy's monasteries quietly removed references to the pop. Royal genealogies trimmed his bio like bad hair. William, conqueror of England, defender of the realm. Skip, skip, skip. Beloved by God. But the common people? Oh, they loved it. Because while kings wanted to be remembered for battles and bloodlines, peasants remembered the humanity, the sweat, the stink. The fact that this towering, terrifying man, this architect of empires, died as embarrassingly as a drunk uncle at a family feast. And as literacy spread and books made their slow way into hands beyond the clergy, the tale went from spoken folklore to footnote to full-on historical curiosity. By the 1700s, an eccentric English scholar named Bartholomew Dimsdale published a niche and slightly unhinged pamphlet titled The Rot of Majesty, an inquiry into regal combustion. In it, he theorized that certain royal diets, heavy on salted meats, dried fruits, and complete lack of hydration, could turn a noble's gut into what he called a chamber of catastrophic humors. He cited William as his prime case, complete with an illustrated diagram that frankly looked more like a pie about to explode than a person. It sold terribly, but it fueled something else: fascination, curiosity, the morbid kind. In the Victorian era, when death became an aesthetic and every house had at least one velvet-curtained photo of a dead aunt, the legend of King William's final boom saw yet another revival. Penny Dreadfuls retold the story with added drama. The king convulsed, the priest wept, the stone coffin cracked, and from its crevice a green serpent of vapor hissed toward heaven. One lurid woodcut even showed William flying out of his coffin like a cannonball. All fictional, of course, but by then, the truth didn't matter anymore. The story had become its own beast. By the early 1900s, the tale of King William's post-mortem misfortune had cemented itself into that odd corner of historical lore where truth, myth, and morbid curiosity all held hands. The Victorians, of course, couldn't resist. They were obsessed with death. Death masks, seances, spiritualism, locks of hair kept in pendants. So the idea that a powerful medieval monarch had died so gruesomely and humiliatingly, that was catnip. Theatrical societies began dramatizing the event in candlelit parlors. One troupe even staged a shadow play titled The Bursting of the Bastard, complete with smoke effects, Latin chants, and a suspicious amount of belly slapping. Historians, meanwhile, were divided. Some tried to explain away the explosion as a case of gas buildup in high summer. Others claimed the event had been greatly exaggerated by anti-Norman chroniclers with a flair for drama. A few insisted it never happened at all. But the people? They weren't interested in revisions. They liked the story as it was. Ridiculous, unforgettable, and weirdly comforting. because it reminded everyone, from peasants to professors, that even the most powerful men in history could end up as bloated cautionary tales. And here's the twist: even royalty couldn't ignore it anymore. In 1953, during the coronation preparations for Queen Elizabeth II, a private letter was discovered in the royal archives. It was from King George V to a bishop, and it read, "Let us ensure the body lies sealed, safe, and not in the manner of William the Conqueror. God rest his soul and his abdominal integrity." Even hundreds of years later, the pop was still echoing through the monarchy. Museums began displaying artifacts related to William: his armor, his coinage, his battle plans. But the gift shops? They leaned into the legend. T-shirts, novelty candles, plush toys shaped like overstuffed coffins. One daring artist even created a resin statue called the Final Coronation, featuring a rather round king mid-burst, with a plaque that read, "He came, he saw, he combusted." Modern historians, at least the more daring ones, began calling this historical curiosity the royal boom phenomenon. One BBC documentary even tried to recreate the conditions using a pig carcass, a coffin replica, and a heat lamp. It did not end well for the cameraman. But behind all the jokes and dark fascination, there was something strangely honest about the tale. Because history often tries to polish power, to make kings seem eternal, cold statues in quiet halls. But William's story, explosive and absurd, refused to be sanitized. It was loud. It was undignified. It was real. And perhaps that's why it lasted so long. Because for every king who wanted to be remembered for their crown, there were thousands of people who remembered the man beneath it, sweating, swearing, bloating in a hot summer chapel, just trying to fit into a box that could never hold him. And in that way, William left behind more than land, laws, or legacies. He left behind a reminder that no matter how grand your tombstone is, no matter how many titles you earn, or how many pages your name fills, history might just remember you for the day your belly made a noise louder than all your battles combined. And so, the man who changed the course of English history was remembered not for his reforms, not for his battles, not for the legacy of Norman rule, but for his ruptured belly and exploding coffin. You could almost hear him groan from the grave. After all, William the Conqueror had spent his whole life forcing history to remember him. He built castles, crowned kings, redrew the borders of nations. But in the end, one summer day, one too small coffin, one ill-timed foom, that was what stuck. There's a strange poetry to it. The man who tried to conquer death itself by carving his name into the very bones of England was undone by the one thing every human shares: a body. A fragile, bloating, gas-filled body. So when you walk through Westminster Abbey or Caen Cathedral, when you see marble effigies and granite tombs and grand words etched in gold, just remember, even the mightiest kings go soft in the end. Even legends can leak. And while others may lie still and silent in their stone beds, William went out with a bang. The only monarch to turn his funeral into a historical firework. A legacy sealed with a pop.